Have you ever stopped to imagine what it will be like trying to explain to your child or grandchild what your life was like today? How will it be to describe that you needed to memorize phone numbers, that you got lost on the streets without GPS, that you waited a week to develop photos, that you bought CDs in physical stores, that you watched television at fixed times? More than that, how will you explain that you once had to choose between answering the phone or using the internet, that there were payphones on street corners, that you carried paper maps in your car's glove compartment? As strange as it may seem now, there's a real possibility that your child simply won't be able to understand how it was possible to live that way. And this inability of mutual understanding between generations isn't just about technology, it's about something much deeper that's happening to us as a species. We're living through the first moment in human history when the gap between consecutive generations has become so vast that it threatens to completely break the chain of cultural transmission that defines us as humanity. Your child won't just use different technologies. They will inhabit a cognitive reality fundamentally distinct from yours. And you, in turn, probably can no longer fully understand how your parents lived their youths. We're witnessing something unprecedented: the fragmentation of human experience into isolated generational islands, each with their own language, values, fears, and dreams that become progressively more incomprehensible to the others. For millennia, human experience was founded on continuity. A young farmer in ancient Rome could converse with his grandfather about planting and harvesting using practically the same techniques, the same knowledge, the same concerns. Tools changed slowly, techniques were gradually refined, but the core of experience remained recognizable across generations. A medieval craftsman spent years learning exactly the same movements that his master had learned decades before. The stories that a grandfather told his grandson were understandable because both inhabited a structurally similar world. Even great historical transformations, like the invention of writing, agriculture, or the Industrial Revolution, happened on timescales that allowed some continuity between generations. One generation experienced the beginning of change, the next lived the transition, and the following adapted to the new normal. There was time for knowledge and wisdom to be transferred, adapted, integrated. There was time for families and communities to collectively process transformations and create shared narratives about what was happening. But that has completely changed. Today, you live in a world where fundamental changes in human experience happen not over centuries, but over years or even months. Your child was born into a world where the internet always existed, where information was always available instantly, where social connection happens through screens, where attention is fragmented into constant notifications, where reality can be augmented or virtual, where artificial intelligences answer questions and create art. For them, the experience of not knowing something and having to accept that temporary ignorance is almost unthinkable. The experience of being bored, of not having constant stimulation, of needing to wait, of dealing with uncertainty without being able to check immediately, these are central elements of your formation that simply don't exist in their reality, but it goes beyond that. Your child is developing neural structures, attention patterns, ways of processing information and relating to the world that are fundamentally different from yours. They don't just use different tools, they think differently. And this difference deepens with each passing year, while you still carry in your memory the experience of a slower, more analog, more predictable world. Your child is being shaped by algorithms that know their preferences better than they do themselves, by virtual realities that become progressively more convincing than physical reality, by artificial intelligences that will soon be more capable than human intelligence in practically any specific task. When they reach your age, they'll be living in a world that you can't even adequately imagine. And here lies the most disturbing paradox of our era. Precisely at the moment when we most need accumulated wisdom and historical perspective to navigate these unprecedented transformations, we're rapidly losing our capacity to transmit knowledge and experience between generations. Think about the irony of this situation. We have access to more historical information than any previous generation. We can study in detail how past societies faced crises, how previous technologies transformed human life, how patterns of social change developed over millennia. Yet, paradoxically, this informational wealth becomes increasingly less relevant to the practical decisions we need to make. The lessons your grandfather learned about relationships, work, purpose, community were developed in a context of relative stability, where the rules of the game remained fundamentally the same for decades. But the rules of the game are changing so rapidly now that accumulated wisdom becomes obsolete before it can even be fully articulated and transmitted. Your child will grow up in a world where the notion of stable careers has completely disappeared, where the concept of nationality becomes increasingly irrelevant, where the distinction between public and private has dissolved, where the line between human and artificial has become indistinct, where the very notion of objective reality is being questioned by technologies that allow the creation of completely convincing but artificial sensory experiences. How can you prepare them for this when you yourself are desperately trying to understand these changes in real time? How do you transmit values and principles when the contexts where these values made sense are disappearing? Even more disturbing is realizing that this generational fragmentation is accelerating. The distance between you and your parents is probably already greater than the distance between your parents and your grandparents. But the distance between you and your children will be astronomically greater than the distance between you and your parents. And the distance between your children and your grandchildren will be even greater. We're watching the creation of a world where each generation becomes progressively more alienated from the previous ones, where cultural continuity breaks down completely, where the very notion of tradition or ancestral wisdom loses any practical meaning. Let me pause for a moment to ask, do you also feel this generational vertigo in your daily life? This strange sensation that you can no longer predict what kind of world you're preparing your children to inhabit? When you try to give advice based on your experience, do you feel that your words sound inadequate, outdated, irrelevant to the challenges they will really face? I know many of us keep this anxiety in silence, perhaps for fear of admitting that we feel lost in our own role as guides and mentors. But you're not alone in this. If this feeling resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. It can be as simple as writing, I feel this generational disconnect when, filling in with your personal experience, your comment might be exactly what another parent needs to read today to understand they're not alone in this navigation through completely unknown waters. Sometimes, collectively acknowledging our disorientation is the first step toward finding wiser ways to deal with it. But it's important to understand that this fragmentation isn't just an unfortunate side effect of technological progress. It's a defining characteristic of a new phase of human evolution. For most of our history as a species, our main evolutionary advantage was our ability to accumulate and transmit knowledge culturally, while other animals depend primarily on genetically programmed instincts or limited individual learning. We developed the unique ability to build knowledge collectively across generations. Each generation could stand on the shoulders of the previous ones, refining, expanding, deepening accumulated wisdom. This capacity for cumulative cultural transmission was what allowed us to emerge from caves, develop agriculture, build civilizations, create art, science, philosophy. But now, for the first time in human history, the speed of technological and social change has exceeded our capacity for cultural adaptation. Our systems of knowledge transmission between generations simply weren't designed to handle transformations of this magnitude and speed. We're facing a fundamental evolutionary crisis. Our main mechanism of adaptation and survival as a species is failing. And this has consequences that go far beyond the personal discomfort of not understanding the slang or technologies of young people. When we lose cultural continuity between generations, we also lose our capacity to make wise collective judgments about the direction of our evolution as a species. The most important decisions about humanity's future are being made by people who don't have real access to the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of human experience, simply because that wisdom has become inaccessible or apparently irrelevant in the new context. We're navigating transformations that will determine our species' destiny using only the knowledge and perspective of a single generation, a generation that is itself desperately trying to understand changes that are happening faster than our ability to process them adequately. Think about the implications of this for questions like artificial intelligence, genetic editing, space colonization, human life extension, virtual reality, or human-machine fusion. These aren't just technical questions that can be solved by specialists. They're deeply philosophical and ethical questions that affect the very core of what it means to be human. But how can we make wise decisions about these transformations when we've lost access to the perspectives and insights developed over millennia of human experience? How can we evaluate whether a particular innovation is truly beneficial for humanity when we no longer have a shared sense of what constitutes human flourishing, developed and refined through generations? The situation becomes even more complex when we realize that your child won't just live in a technologically different world from yours, but will develop forms of consciousness and cognition that may be fundamentally alien to you. Human brains are incredibly plastic, especially during childhood and adolescence. The way we process information, direct attention, form memories, create meaning, establish relationships, all of this is profoundly shaped by the cultural and technological environment in which we grow up. Your child is growing up in an environment that is literally reconfiguring their neural structure in ways we don't yet fully understand. Children who grow up with smartphones and social media develop attention patterns completely different from those who grew up reading books. Young people who grow up playing video games develop spatial and visual processing skills that previous generations never had. Adolescents who grow up communicating primarily through text and emojis develop forms of emotional expression and intimacy that are foreign to generations that grew up with face-to-face conversation as the norm. And these differences aren't superficial. They represent fundamental reorganizations in how the human brain develops and functions, but we're only at the beginning of this transformation. Your child will grow up with artificial intelligences as constant companions, with virtual realities indistinguishable from physical reality, with brain-computer interfaces that allow direct communication between minds, with technologies that can modify memories, emotions, and thought processes. They will develop forms of identity, relationship, creativity, and purpose that may be as different from your experience as your experience is different from that of a hunter-gatherer from 10,000 years ago. And here we arrive at the deepest paradox of our situation. Precisely when we most need stability, continuity, and accumulated wisdom to navigate these transformations, we are experiencing the opposite: fragmentation, discontinuity, and accelerated obsolescence of knowledge. We're being forced to make the most important decisions in human history with minimal historical and cultural preparation. It's as if we're trying to cross the most tempestuous ocean ever faced by human navigators, but with maps that have become useless and compasses that point in directions that never existed before. This doesn't mean we should despair or try to reverse inevitable technological changes. It means we need to consciously develop new forms of wisdom that are adequate for this era of accelerated transformation. We need to find ways to preserve and transmit the deepest insights about human nature developed over millennia in forms that remain relevant even when external contexts change drastically. We need to learn to distinguish between aspects of human experience that are culturally specific and temporary, and aspects that are fundamental and timeless. More importantly, we need to develop sufficient humility to recognize that we don't have all the answers to the challenges our children will face. Instead of trying to impose our inadequate solutions to problems we don't yet fully understand, we need to focus on developing fundamental capacities in them: critical thinking, emotional intelligence, adaptive flexibility, compassion, courage, and above all, the ability to ask deep questions about what really matters in human life. Because in the end, despite all technological and social transformations, certain questions remain constant. How should we live? What constitutes a meaningful life? How can we create authentic and satisfying relationships? How do we find purpose amid uncertainty? How do we deal with suffering, loss, and mortality? How do we balance our individual needs with collective responsibilities? These fundamental questions of the human condition don't disappear with new technologies. They just manifest in new and more complex contexts. The most important task we face may not be trying to predict exactly what the future will be like or preparing our children for specific scenarios, but helping them develop the inner wisdom necessary to navigate any future with integrity and purpose. This means focusing less on specific technical skills that may quickly become obsolete and more on fundamental human capacities that remain relevant regardless of external changes. We need to help our children understand that despite all changes, they're still fundamentally human, with basic human needs for connection, meaning, growth, and contribution. We need to teach them to distinguish between innovations that genuinely serve human flourishing and those that simply create dependence or distraction. We need to develop in them the courage to question dominant narratives and the wisdom to discern when changes represent real progress versus simply change for change's sake. Perhaps most importantly, we need to model for them how it's possible to remain centered and integral amid accelerated transformation. How it's possible to embrace beneficial changes without losing sight of fundamental values. How it's possible to adapt to new realities without sacrificing our essential humanity. How it's possible to innovate and grow while maintaining connection with ancestral wisdom that remains relevant. This requires of us a form of maturity that no previous generation needed to develop. The ability to be simultaneously adaptable and rooted, open to change and committed to principles, innovative and reverent toward traditions that deserve preservation. We need to learn to discern which aspects of human experience are negotiable and which are non-negotiable, which traditions serve our flourishing and which simply represent cultural inertia. And perhaps, paradoxically, this apparent fragmentation between generations can become an opportunity for richer and more conscious forms of connection. When we honestly recognize that we can't simply transmit our experience directly to our children, we are forced to engage in more creative and dialogical ways. Instead of assuming authority based on past experience, we need to learn to build mutual understanding through genuine curiosity about the different realities each generation faces. Your child may not understand how you used to live, but you can explore together what remains universal in human experience despite all superficial changes. You can discover together new ways to apply ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges. You can create bridges of understanding that honor both the richness of accumulated experience and the need for innovation and adaptation. In the end, perhaps the question isn't how to make your child understand how you used to live, but how you can both understand together how to live with wisdom and purpose in this era of unprecedented transformation. How you can collaborate in creating ways of life that honor the best of human heritage while embracing the genuine potential of new possibilities. How you can be joint students and teachers in the School of Humanity's Conscious Evolution, because one thing is certain: we're all learning to navigate this unknown territory together. No generation has the complete answers. No individual perspective is sufficient for the complexity of the challenges we face. We need the wisdom of elders and the vision of youth. We need the stability of tradition and the creativity of innovation. We need the depth of lived experience and the breadth of imagination about future possibilities. If these reflections resonated with your own questions about how to navigate the generational changes we're all experiencing. And if you feel you need more insights to understand not just how to prepare your children for an uncertain future, but how to find your own place in a world of accelerated transformation, I invite you to join us in this continuing conversation. By subscribing to the channel, you'll become part of a community of people who, like you, are trying to understand the deeper implications of the changes we're living through and find wiser ways to respond to them. Each week, we explore together these fundamental questions that define our time, always seeking not just understanding, but practical wisdom for living with more integrity and purpose amid uncertainty. This is a journey we're taking together, and each perspective and experience contributes to our collective understanding. Subscribe to continue this essential exploration of what it means to be human in an era of unprecedented transformation, and to discover together how we can thrive individually and collectively in the extraordinary times ahead.
You really not use a smartphone?
For many years, I just didn't have a phone. Then it became too difficult because, again, many services just demanded, like the bank or the doctor, that I have a phone. So I keep it, but I try to use it instead of being used by it. It's not on me all the time. I'm not addicted to it. I'm not checking it all the time. I try to use it as a tool. When you destroy an order and you don't have any alternative order, what you get is chaos. What you get is disorder. We are on really the edge of the precipice in two distinct but related ways. On the one hand, after the most peaceful era in human history of the last few decades, which was a very problematic, very violent era in many ways. I come from the Middle East, I know this perfectly well, but in comparative terms, it was still the most peaceful era in human history, characterized by unprecedented levels of cooperation and also of human prosperity. The order that enabled this is now collapsing. There is no viable alternative, at least we don't hear of one at the present. When you destroy an order and you don't have any alternative order, what you get is chaos. What you get is disorder. We are now falling into chaos, into disorder. The danger is that levels of violence, which have been historically low over the last 20, 30, 40 years, could become worse than ever, because of the technologies of destruction that we are creating and amassing. It's just a tiny symbol of the times that has been commented in recent days by many people, that change in terminology in the United States from Department of Defense to Department of War.
What did you make of that? Yeah.
It's plain. There is no need of very complicated explanations. It's just shifting from defense to war. What could be more easy to understand?
When comparing AI, say, to the threat of nuclear war has no upside. It has no supporters. It's a huge, huge threat, especially in today's world, when we see that countries like Russia are just completely disregarding the biggest taboos of the international system. Since 1945, the biggest taboo of the international system was that a strong country cannot just invade and try to conquer and destroy a weaker country. And now this is broken. So the danger is huge, but at least everybody understands the danger. There are no winners in a nuclear war. With AI, it's a much more complicated challenge. There is a huge positive potential, and people find it very difficult to understand what the threats are. Ever since the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was at least clear to humans what is the danger of nuclear technology. You don't need long explanations. With AI, it's difficult to grasp the danger because it's really an alien threat.